Alright, this is Adam from Invisible Hand Studios, and today I'm going to show you how I do my freehand dungeon style bases for games like Massive Darkness or Zombicide Black Plague. I'm going to start out with a base coat. This is just your standard square Games Workshop 50mm base, but you can do this to any base of any size. I'll start out with a solid black base coat, and this is Vallejo model color black. Alright, we're going to let that dry, and then we'll move on to the next step. Next step, we're going to take some Games Workshop Mechanica Standard Gray, and it's not critical that this is thin too much or that it even applies an even coat, considering we're going to go back with several different layers and effects to get our final result. Alright, I'm going to let that dry, and then we'll go on to our next step. Alright, now that that layer of Mechanica Standard Gray is dry, we're going to go on to painting grout lines to start to define our stones. I'm using a Winsor & Newton Series 7 size 1, and the color for the grout is Privateer Press P3 Crixbane base. And with this, you really just want to define any sort of shapes, whether your dungeon has square stones, round stones, big or small, doesn't necessarily matter. And they don't have to be accurate. What you're looking for is just to get a defined shape. And I typically like to start with a line down the middle, then do a couple opposing lines, thick lines, thin lines. It doesn't matter, because this is something that we can go back through and define later. So as it starts out, it doesn't look anything like anything special. But as you just go through, start to get the shapes you want. Start to end up with something like that. Alright, and then going back to Mechanica Standard Gray, I'm going to go back in some of the stone areas that were a little patchy. Just going to go back and fill those in, just to kind of give them another solid base coat. And here is a good opportunity to sort of work your grout lines that got a little misshapen or out of whack, or if you just weren't happy with how thick or thin they were. And then I'm going to go through, touch up a few areas, and then we'll go back and start the highlighting stage. Once you got your grout lines and everything defined, you'll see the basic shapes of your stones. Using two different brushes, we're going to do a technique called two-brush blending. And basically what that means is I'm going to use just a regular hobby store craft brush, nothing special. and then I'm going to have my Winsor & Newton Series 7 size 1 that I'm going to use to do some blending. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of P3's Crixbane highlight, and importantly what you need to do is pick the direction that your light is going to come from, because that's going to dictate the highlights as they fall over your stones. So I'm going to say that this light's coming from this direction, and it's going to catch this side of the stone. So what you'll do is you'll run your brush, make sure it's fully loaded with paint. You're going to run your brush along the grout line on that side of the stone. And you're just going to follow it down. It doesn't have to be perfect because it's going to get blended. I'm going to set that brush down and grab my other brush that's been wet, and I'm going to start dragging it back and forth. And what that's going to do is that's going to create some surface tension, or eliminate some, and then once I touch that paint, I'm just going to drag it all the way to the base edge. Just like that. And then I'm going to go back, rinse my brush off, pick up my other one, and I'm going to repeat that process. Now you only want to do it on the side that the light's hitting. So like this side, you don't want to do it on the opposing side, because then that'll confuse your mind's eye as to the actual light source. So for instance, again, start right here, bring it on around. You just kind of stop like that. And it's okay to use a heavy layer of paint, and it doesn't matter if you get on the grout lines, because again we'll go back and fix it again. So with my wet brush, I'm just going to drag it on the darker surface, and as I touch the lighter color, I'm just going to drag it back towards the edge of the base. It doesn't have to look pretty. We can go back and fix all of this. And when that dries, you'll eventually be left with a nice transition. Alright, I'm going to show one more. Some of these stones, you've only got the one edge that's going to catch light. So you just run just a thick layer of paint. Doesn't have to be thinned at all. You can do this straight out of the pot. Just like that. I grab my wet brush, and again, running it along this first to break the surface tension, touch the paint, and as you see it start to kind of mix with the wet, you're gonna grab you a layer and then just bring it back towards that base edge. Alright, now I'm going to go through and tackle all these, and we'll check it out when I'm done. Now once you do all that, your base is going to look pretty bad. You're going to be all over the grout lines, and it's not going to look as clean as you'd want, but again, we're going to go back and fix that. So you should end up with something like this, kind of neat highlights. And using Games Workshop Rakarth Flesh, we are going to give that a final highlight to the edges of the stones. Here I'm using the Monument size 1, their Bomb Wick Igniter series, and I like this brush for some of the finer detail. Now along these edges right here where you've given them the highlight, you want to give an extreme highlight right along that grout line, and this won't be blended, and you just want to grab the very top of that, because the biggest way to get contrast is to put your brightest brights right next to your darkest darks. In this case, putting this little highlight right here along these edges will get you just that. You can start to see that coming together. I'll do a couple more of these, and then I'll show you what we have when we come back. So I'm going to go through and hit the rest of those, but for now you can kind of see the effect we got going. And then we'll be back. Once you get your extreme highlights, it's going to look like that. Not quite like the stones, but We're going to have a couple more steps and then it's really going to come together. So going back to the Winsor & Newton Series 7 size 1 and then the P3 Cricks Bane base, you're going to go back and you're going to kind of fix all these little areas, and then you'll also be able to more or less shape your stones. So if I were to start kind of down here, I'm going to just barely skirt the edge of those highlights, but then to kind of add a little character to our stone shapes and not make them all similar in size and shape, I'm going to round a few out. And this is really where your final cleanup is going to come in, and a lot of this is going to come together. And it's okay to make some of them much smaller than they were when they started out. And sort of give them their own shape. Now I'm going to go through and clean all these up, and then I'll show you what we're left with before the final step, and I'll be back. Alright, once you finish doing your grout lines, you should be left with some cool shapes, different size stones. Looks a whole lot different than when we started. The last step, well, the second to last, is you're going to take your Army Painter Strong Tone. I'm not a huge fan of the Army Painter washes. To me, they're very viscous and almost create like a film. But with these bases, they work perfectly. What I'm going to do is just load up just a big wedge brush, and I'm just going to slather it all over. And what this is going to do is completely cover any mistakes or any issues that we had. And then once I get it covered, I like to go back and just kind of tap the brush. And what that's going to do is kind of help eliminate brush strokes. It also makes it look like some natural pooling of just general dirt and grime. Then I'll wet my brush, come back with it nice and clean, and then just kind of, I don't really know how to describe it, you just kind of play around with it to clean it up while also making it dirty. It's a very, very simple process. You just get it to where you're happy. And then you should be left with something looking like that. Once that's dry, what I do is I'll take my Vallejo black and I'll go around the edges, and what that does is it frames your base, and I'll show you the final product as soon as this is all dry. And when you're done, this is what you'll end up with. A dark and gritty sort of dungeon base that you can use in any of your games. I did mine for Massive Darkness and Zombicide Black Plague, but something like this would fit in well with Dungeons and Dragons or any sort of game you play. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope it was informative. You can find my page on Facebook at Invisible Hand Studios, and make sure you stay on the lookout in the Discover Games YouTube channel for more content. Adios.